It is pretty hot up here.
It is pretty hot, yeah. When I did the Black sonatas, I think it was 100 degrees up here. The sweat was pouring off me, but even in the night, I mean, you have to record at night, of course, here because of the traffic. We got here, we had 3 nights, and the first night we were listening, and what is that sound? They were cleaning out the sewers. You know, it's always, you know how that is, it's always something like that. So we didn't get anything in, and then the birds start like crazy at 4. It would start around midnight. It's kind of weird, and then you go to 4, you know, 4:30, maybe 11. This is a fantasy reconstruction of a very famous instrument made by the greatest North German, indeed one of the great European organ builders of all time, Arp Schnitger. And it reflects his, in a way, his ideal aesthetic. It's the classic setup of his instruments. You know, the whole business about it's the most evolved technology really along with clocks, before the Industrial Revolution, and this is like a massive synthesizer, and it comes at a time when the organ is beginning to try to imitate other instruments, modern instruments like the oboe and stuff like that, you know. The impetus for the CD is the idea that Handel was one of the greatest organists of his time, praised by his contemporaries, along with Bach, at the top of the list of great German organists, and the Germans consider themselves the greatest organists because they were able to use their feet and hands produce these incredible textures, polyphonic and otherwise. And these instruments are the kind that Handel would have known in his youth before he went to England and lived there from 1711 on, where the organs had no pedals. France had pedals, but it's the Germans that went nuts with the feet. They really made substantial music with their feet, sometimes alone, but also in these larger textures. The feet are underused in music. The Germans, except for the Germans, we don't really use them. I mean, drummers, harpists, sort of pianists. At that time, too, just the level of virtuosity was reaching a high, as it were, pitch. You know, and the whole business of playing even multiple lines with your feet, which is something that had been done early on. You can also do, high. You can do "Can't Just Fear Me." You can bring a. But then there are also these big, very dramatic solos that they would do, sometimes to introduce their free works. And there's some of that in this recording, some cadenzas that I threw in that feature that kind of fancy footwork. Handel, he did go back to the continent a few times, famously played the massive organ, then knew one of the most famous instruments in the world still, at Haarlem. St. Bob was in Haarlem, and it has a massive pedal division. So what did he do? I mean, the idea for me is that he must have played something. Probably he was out of practice with those feet. I mean, he did of a Sunday go play at St. Paul's, which was perhaps the only instrument of any size in England that did have a small pedal board. There were little chances for him to do it, but the kind of four-limbed performance that was typical of what he had learned as a German was completely impossible, basically, for him to do there. In guides to German cities, the organist would often be named. The chance to hear him would be the Vespers service on Saturday night, and that was a kind of marquee event for those visiting these big Hanseatic cities where they had these kinds of massive organs with massive pedal divisions and all these kinds of colors, which the organist could display in various ways. Johann Adam Reinken, and the famous account of Bach playing his 2-hour organ recital in Hamburg, which was the greatest organ city in Northern Europe, with 5 instruments twice as big as this in the principal churches. He played for 2 hours, and of course he played with his feet all through that. If you didn't play with your feet, you weren't an organist. Yeah. The comparison of Bach and Handel, written by J.S. Bach's second son, C.P. Bach, published in 1788, the year of C.P. Bach's death, says there's no comparison. Handel gave up playing the pedals, even though he was a German, because he moved to England, and therefore he couldn't produce the kind of organ music. Of course, he left no organ music. That's the reason, one of the reasons. He just didn't have it in him and didn't have the possibility. He had forgotten how to be a German and an organist. Well, he didn't really leave, his 2 sets of organ concertos, and actually the one in Opus 7, I can't quite remember how that goes, does have an independent pedal part, and he had a special organ made for him that could be put on the stage in the theater so that he could display that. But okay, for the English, that was it's pretty amazing that someone could play that fast line and start. It's kind of a ground brace that goes around and around in B flat, but it's really nothing compared. You know, as I said in the book, it's like what a climbing wall is to the Eiger itself. You know, I mean, it's really, I mean, it's a kind of a gimmick. I guess all of it is certainly a gimmick. But yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the thing is, he didn't leave any organ music. He left one set of voluntaries that are pillaged, much of them from other sources, and there is absolutely no pedal in them.
But he's certainly known as a great organist.
Yeah, in Germany he was, yeah. And certainly as a young man, he went with his friend Johann Matteson to Lübeck, was one of the great organ centers, the capital of the Hanseatic League, to essentially audition for the post of organist at the Church of St. Mary's, where Buxtehude was, and Buxtehude was still alive, and of course he would have had to show that he could play, you know, that level of sophistication with all four limbs. I mean, I've reinvented him, I guess, in a certain way as a German organist. That's the project. Like this piece is essentially what these big North Germans would do, and what Bach did. You know, he left one piece with double pedal, and so I made this into a double pedal exploration, as if it were a chorale that has this characteristic technique of 2 parts in the left hand, 2 parts in the feet, and then solo in the right hand. And then in the B section, invert that and give the pedal a kind of pedal solo wacky thing. I'm not sure there are other examples of that in the 18th century, but certainly the double pedal thing is very, you know, very Bachian, very Reinkenian. You know, he is pretty important to the Germans, although he doesn't. You know, he gets a statue too. He gets an edition in the 19th century. Chrysander writes a huge biography of him. That's as thick as the one that Spitta wrote for Bach, but I suppose ultimately because he left Germany, he didn't have the kind of cachet, and he didn't write Lutheran church music also, and chorales and this rich body of material that really draws on this ur-German mentality. It's not just that it's art as religion, but that there's a strongly religious element in it. Yeah, Handel, you know, he too was a great virtuoso with the keyboard, and so I'm just trying to imagine if he'd never left Germany and had this kind of instrument at his disposal. He did play them on his return trips to scout singers and visit his mother, though he never met up with Bach, who was eager to meet him, and head to an organ and see what he could do. So I just kind of imagine Handel actually spending some time getting his chops in gear so he can meet up with Bach and have a go. Essentially that comparison between Bach and Handel by C.V. Bach that made me think, well, what if Handel actually had left some serious German-style organ music. He didn't, so we're going to have to invent it, figure it out, cull it from other sources. He was a great cannibalizer of his own music and others, so we do that to him and add some stuff here and there and reimagine it. Long way from England, where the organs were not this big, not this sophisticated, at least in my view, and didn't have the pedal. He was a man of the theater, you know, and those operas were not performed, so I think that also didn't help him in the 19th century, you know, as something that you had on your shelf. There were editions being made, but the first performance of, I think it's Xerxes is the first one they redo, I can't remember, in the 1920s, you know, and now of course you have these great pieces being performed in the theater, and he's hugely popular in that way, at least in the world of opera. You have the oratorios, and those are huge in Germany and in England, and important part of just the projection of empire and building that nation, because he never went out of fashion, you know, his music. So I think he's pretty important there. And you know, the Messiah, those things are big in Germany too, you know, also in the early 19th century. C.P. Bach led a performance of the Hallelujah Chorus, and I know that My Redeemer Liveth already in the 70s, I guess. I did a lot of vocal music, basically. I took trio sonatas and just played them on the organ. They kind of work. You have to do some adaptation. And then I put things together, you know, I did the Overture for Messiah, but then took one of the great sweet fugues, but then basically added some other voices to make it, you know, coherent, more German, you know, a little more dedicated in its contrapuntal integrity. So I refashioned some of his stuff. But you know, Handel writes great tunes, and he really knows how to develop his material. He doesn't do that in his fugues and things as rigorously as Bach does, but they're fun. You know, I have been a little bit opportunistic in the way I've imagined this program. It isn't as I've spent huge amounts of time trying, so this off camera, trying to understand Handel's style. Just take what I have and then work with that with the idea of building a program. Handel, if he embarked on this kindred project, he would have done it way better than I would have done. So that's just the reality of it.
One of the things about how historical performance practice is received by, let's say, conventional performers is the sense that there is a kind of highly specialized, highly orthodoxical way of thinking about this music. But when you're actually inside of it, you find that you're having to just kind of make ends meet, as it were. Does that sound about right?
Yeah. I think it's practical. There's a reason you're doing it, to fill up time.
Fill up time.
You know what I mean? I mean, it's Gebrauchsmusik. There's a purpose to do it. Of course, now we do it because it's an avocation. We think it's fun.
I see. Like in a service or something.
Yeah.
You're trying, I see.
It's got a purpose. I did some jazz in high school. I was sort of interested in improvised music then, and had some really talented people that I played with. And then I had one of the great improvisers of our time, William Porter, who teaches at Eastman. But I met him in Boston when I was a student at Harvard, and he is the great man, and he kind of got me going on it. And then I just tried to learn a few little things here and there. I did like to play in services, especially when I was living in Germany, playing hymns and introducing them. And I haven't played services in a long time, and so it's not something that I really do anymore. Whereas Bill's, he lives that stuff. I don't know. You have these forms, that you try to articulate. I guess when you're doing this kind of music, just a little theme that you want to develop. That's not what I wanted to do. But yeah, so you build up little techniques that you can use to elaborate. So I think basically it's a kind of mode of elaborating themes that are useful in church, hymn tunes, and then ground bass things. Just there's a whole bunch of genres. So what are you listening to in those moments? If you're playing. I mean, this is really, if you're playing. That's how you learn the stuff, as you build up the licks. I mean, that's also a jazz thing. These catalog of things that you can then deploy. There are recipes, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily copying. You're doing different things, but it's it's in a way it's composing. You're putting these ideas together. That's all, after all, what composing is too in the 18th century sense. So you have this lexicon of units of ideas, and then if you're lucky, something interesting happens. You have enough experience with the music to figure out what's tasteful and what's appropriate. But then, of course, you want to bring in your own. There's one piece that I did. It's this famous Lascia ch'io pianga from Rinaldo. It's one of these famous, let's see, it's in here somewhere. One of the most famous arias that he reused many times. And it, I don't remember how he did it on the record exactly. There are some 18th century elaborations of this that survive, and one can be very effusive or be a little more measured. So I got a little more out there at the end, but you know. You know, you can do anything with it, but maybe you'd be criticized if you went too far. I think there's something on the. See, I think there's something I did on the record. Something like that, you know. So that's getting a little more extravagant. But some of these 18th century ones put that to shame, you know. When you think about Corelli, some of these adagios that survived that were ornamented from the early 18th century. These are
like where the ornamentations are written out essentially to show what you could do.
Yeah, we're in general just too tepid in our engagement with this music, and that I think that's why I tried to make this in a lot of ways extravagant and over the top. You know, the Banquet, Handel was feasting, and I just wanted to let him sate himself. Can you say that? Just to give examples, I mean, the most extreme example on the record of this is the Amen, the great fugue from the end of Messiah that closes it out. You know the one. I play this on full organ. Should I explain that or no? Just pull out the stops. Yeah, just pull out the stops. People know what that means. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's not every stop. Basically, what I'm pulling out is the principal chorus, the original organ sound, 8-foot, 4-foot, and then the crowning mixture. And then I add a reed stop to give it even more bite. Let's see, let's do it in D. Then the reed, and then 16-foot. And then in the pedal, I essentially add the same thing, this principal chorus of, build that up, so we're getting many, many notes for just a one pitch that I'm playing in my foot, and then also reeds here. So. Etc. It goes on, and then when it reaches its climax here. I'm getting ready to do something different. And then this over-the-top 18th century thing. There's a famous 18th century, well, there's an important 18th century treatise that lays out just how to do that kind of thing.
Like that kind of
the
polyphonic
4-part stuff, where the writer who certainly knew J.S. Bach's eldest son's music, maybe even studied with him in Halle, Wilhelm Friedrich Bach, who this writer, Johann Samuel Petri, describes as a lion at the organ. You know, even has stuff where he's playing chords with the heel on a raised note. Stuff like play these chords. Yeah. So that's what I was thinking of for this kind of thing, to actually break out a 4-part little mini fugue as a cadenza built into this piece, which of course completely distorts the piece. I mean, this is a sublime piece that isn't about display, but if you're going to play it at the organ and have this kind of fun, why not? Funnily enough, the very first book about the organ from the first part of the first decade, or I think it's 1511, the Spiegel der the Organisten und Orgelmacher by Arnold Schlick. He says that the best organists, this is the first part of the 16th century, play three parts in their feet, and they do echoes between their feet and their hands. Yet that kind of thing doesn't really survive much, you know. It's unlimited stuff. Once you start playing chords with your feet, I mean, it's something that later organists did more often, but it was an 18th century technique that is really, there's very little literate record of it, but it is there, and so you can reanimate it, I think, in a passage like that, which is exciting and challenging, you know. You know, these sorts of echoes you could imagine sort of in D major. That wasn't a great piece either, but you know, that kind of thing.
How often have you pulled that move? Like the extra hand?
Only when there's a camera. I did it once up at Eastman because there was a closed circuit TV and I was playing one of these kinds of things, and you know, the only time I've gotten a laugh in an organ concert.
The only time?
Well,
Like every
the only
time
one that I can remember. I mean, you know, I was up in the organ loft. There's a repository, or no, well, you can't see anyone, so you're up in this thing, but there is a camera there. So, you know, I had, you know, right. Let's see. I guess you could get it. You could try it that way. So that's that. And then a little more controlled mode, this aria from one of Handel's last oratorios, Theodora, Lord to thee each night and day, which is one of many beautiful arias in the piece. But I decided to set this because it could be adapted to this 4-part texture in the accompaniment, 2 of the parts in the feet, the tenor and bass, and then there's a melody line as well that's decorated. You know, I said, if I'm going to be a North German organist, I'm going to go full on and write it out as they did. And there are some early manuscripts of Johann Sebastian Bach. He continued to use this kind of notation when he needed. But there wasn't enough space to write in staff notation, so he would do corrections with these letters. But there are a couple of longer manuscripts from his early years that adopt exactly this kind of notation, which was typical of the 17th century organists whom Bach admired, some of whom he knew, like Dietrich Buxtehude. So what I had to do is basically compose a new tenor line that gave to the right foot, which is difficult because Handel's counterpoint is brilliant. I mean, he's a master of polyphony. And so I had to find my way through that texture to do something interesting and, of course, playable, because it's not that easy to be hopping around with your right foot. So what it sounds like is this. I can't remember what the registration is I used. And that's another great thing, as many writers on the organ of the 18th century, they would often say an organ of 31 stops, and they would write out the number of permutations. You know, it's a long, long number because it's 31 factorial. To calculate that without the aid of computers, of course, or calculators, is difficult. That also suggests that they were much more adventurous, that we're a little bit narrow in the way we go about exploring new sonorities, new combinations of stops. Fascinating. etc. And then the B section, which is much more tumultuous in the text, I then bring the alto part, is sung by an alto, down into the bass. So this also requires a fair amount of rewriting. Pull out some stops and let the fire happen. Etc. And then finally go. And then we go back to the original sound, gets your stop puller to do it, and you're back. Oh God, sorry, this is not. And then you're going to have a real opportunity to decorate that line with interesting ornaments on the reprise.
How often do you leave something on you didn't mean to, and then it's like,
yeah,
you're like, well, I could fix this, or we just keep going. And
yeah,
that's now. How it sounds.
it happens a lot, and in the last, one of the funnier times was recently when Annette and I, who's Annette Richards, the university organist here, and my life partner, we met in the organ loft back at Stanford in 1988, September 1988, and we're about to celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary next week. And it was a live recording, Belgian National Radio. We were playing on this new Bach organ in Leuven. She has always claimed that I'm terrible to stop puller because I'm just distracted. But she set up the registration. The thing was running on the radio. We were playing Bach canons from the Art of Fugue. She had the wrong stop, so I just kept playing and said, "Look, get the right stops." Just played something. And
I guess you could talk in the organ loft.
Yeah.
Really
And then she did. Is that it? Is it okay? Because I was playing on some other manual, so she could adjust the stops. Okay, now let's try it again. It was wrong again. so I've often now I hold that over. So yeah, when that happens to me, I just keep playing, do something, then come to a cadence, and then with the right stops. Rather, you do hear in organ recitals, people just stop. I say you just have to keep it going and try to build it into what you've got, rather than draw attention to it. It's a good idea to have someone else listen out there too. The tendency, especially for me, someone relatively high strung, is to play too fast. To play here, you can get away with it, I suppose, because it is pretty dry. As far as the balancing, yeah, we know this organ pretty well after nearly 15 years of living with it, but there's many discoveries still to be made. But often you have to ask, does that work if you're playing a trio sonata? Is the balance okay? Can you hear what's going on in the other voices, or all three voices? Is it too loud? And this is a lot of organ for a relatively small space, because we modeled it on a princely chapel where the point is there. You have the money, even though you don't have a large congregation. You just have courtiers and those invited to the service. But you want to display your wealth and the technological achievement and give your musicians a chance to use the finest tools then available. And so it was with this organ. But that means if you're going to play full organ, you have to think about your listeners. If you do that for an hour, they're not going to like it much, because of this idea too of an organ recital where you're sitting there listening for that length of time is a pretty new notion. Certainly the concert is a later 18th century invention. You got to think of them too. But it's easy not to, because you're up here, you're not exposed to the full brunt of the instrument, and you're kind of having fun. It's fantasies of absolute power, basically. Maybe what drives the organist to play the instrument in the first place, I'm not sure. To play the organ is to encounter history, especially if you're going to play old organs. But even this organ, which was built in 2011, is modeled on an old instrument. And so when you sit down, you have to figure out in what world you are. And of course, it's not just for a given repertoire, because organs last a long time. They're very expensive. You don't simply replace them. I mean, the original, which was in the princely chapel in Berlin, Charlottenburg, was in great shape. It was completed in the first decade of the 18th century and survived until the war. It was taken out because it was so precious and put in boxes, the pipes, and taken to what was thought to be a more secure place in the city palace, a much bigger structure. But a bomb went right down one of the shafts in the castle and completely destroyed it. Luckily, it had been documented as it was taken out and also recorded in the 1930s as an important project of the revival of these kinds of repertoires and instruments. So when you sit down at these things, often the octave span, the pedals is different. The whole relationship of the manuals. The organs are the most diverse instruments. Often they're palimpsests. They have pipes from much earlier organs that later builders incorporated into theirs because they respected and also wanted to, economize, but thought these sonorities could be used in a new setting. So you have to make sense of this, and to do that is really reliant on historical awareness and sensitivity. You have to understand what the traditions you're looking at are and how they may have evolved, and then what you can do with them. And it's not just for Bach. This organ plays new music. It plays music before Bach, and it's all about experimentation and respect for what it can provide for you. Good organists are historians. They just have to be. Each organ has a lot to teach you. I mean, it's true of any instrument, but the organ is the extreme example. This is a very well-made organ. Climate is extreme here in upstate New York, from the super dry winters to the fantastically humid summers. And this building looks like a stone building, but it's not. It's I-beam construction. The wind blows. Sometimes in the winter you can see this page moving. So it's, there are some issues there, but so far, 15 years, it's really held up. So these all mechanical instruments, some of them have lasted with very little maintenance. Of course, you do have to attend to them. Not big interventions for a couple hundred years, and then maybe a rebuild. So yeah, we were hoping that this will be here for many decades, if not centuries. Sounds grandiose. That's, of course, when the bombs start to fall, that is its greatest curse. It's really difficult to move these things. Fires, a lot of organs perished in fires. Organists were discouraged from coming to play the organ outside of church services. You had to have candles, and there are accounts of conflagrations that resulted from that, and of course, they're the most expensive musical instrument. Certainly they were in the 18th century. Bach had a Steiner violin. I can't remember what that went for, but his coat was worth more than his Steiner violin, whereas these organs, that's why Bach was also prized as an expert, because church committees needed to make sure they weren't being ripped off, that they got their money's worth, and Bach parlayed that technical knowledge, not just his musical abilities at the instrument, into a rapid ascent up the hierarchy of Lutheran church music, because he knew about the cutting-edge technology of the organ. Handel too, he was not as much of a tech geek as Bach, but he, of course, must have known something about that too. But he's really, more a man of the theater. And the organ, a lot of these, or at least some of these 18th century organs, they have trompe-l'oeil curtains around them. They are very theatrical too, in their way, just the way they, even though they're not moving, but there is a great element of drama, and then I'm sure Handel brought that out too in his playing, Since the Renaissance organs, there was a great flowering of innovation, where new shapes of stops and new sonorities were explored. It was the instrument of instruments. It wasn't just playing the organ sound, but trying to imitate other instruments. This instrument in the early 18th century is trying to do just that with the latest instruments, like the hautboy, spelled H-O-B-O-Y. The spelling here on this, this is a meticulous reconstruction of the spelling of the original with these weird Germanified versions of French, like the flûte douce, recorder, the French word for recorder here, it's F-L-O umlaut T-T-E-D-U-E-S, flûte douce, which is a wooden stop, and is quite beautiful. And there are two of them. There's one at 8-foot pitch on the Hauptwerk, which is the main part of the organ above me, and then there's 4 foot. There's another one down here. Whoops. So that's the flutes, but then you also have the oboe. Just three of the sonatas. There's many others on the organ that imitate instruments, the viola da gamba. You're not going to mistake that for a gamba, but there is you'll be able to recognize that this noisy, it's stringy kind of sound. And then, of course, all these reeds, other reeds like the trumpet. Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach essentially invented the trio sonata at the organ, in which the two hands on different manuals, using some of these orchestral sounds, perhaps, would take, let's say, the violin part in the left hand and maybe an oboe part in the right hand, and then, of course, the basso continuo, the bass line, you can play in your feet. It's the most exposed and most difficult kind of organ playing. There's nothing much to hide behind, and it really is independence, autonomy between the parts. And the fact that it's exposed makes it really harrowing to play this stuff live. You know, the Bach trio sonatas are really, for many, the, as it were, benchmark of organ playing, the hardest. You know, not the most notes, but really technically demanding and relentless, because almost quite a feat just not to fall off the bench, really. I mean, that sounds exaggerated, but there it is. And so Handel wrote a lot of great trios. Again, he couldn't do this sort of thing at the organ because the organs didn't have pedals, really, so in England. But if we put him on an organ like this, he can do that, and we just have to adapt some of these trios to make that possible. So a piece like this, I play one of his trios. We're going to do it with a flute at 8 foot and then at 4 foot, and then this funny thing called a sesquialtura, which plays two pipes, higher pipes at the same time, one playing an octave and a fifth, and one playing actually a major third, 2 octaves and some above that. So it's already playing a chord. It's a very rich, yeah.
It's very tonally disoriented.
Some traditions make use of that very ambiguous quality, but it's, you know, it's almost exotic. So that I've got in the right hand, one violin, and then another violin, at least in the original part, I'll give to a trumpet. You have to adapt a trumpet. Maybe that noisy viola da gamba as a hidden homage to the violin. And then in the pedal, I'm going to have these principal pipes, the default organ setting. But then I'm going to add a posauna, a trombone. So this trio sonata, I'll give the lower part of the 2 manuals to an oboe. The oboe we've heard with maybe the flute. Flute's at 8 and 4. And then in the right hand, 8, 2, and 5th above that. So this without the posaune. that's how it starts, this ground bass. But then eventually, of course, the pedal is going to start doing some big time elaborations. And that's something that's pretty easily adaptable, that genre, the trio sonata. But you do have to make some adjustments with this pedal. You know, I do play some scales, but other times I figure out different ways to get between these notes that
would
we
just
didn't
be
write.
continuo.
Yeah, it's just the continuo part. But you know, it's also a chance for display of the technical chops of your cello player, whoever it is.
Yeah, I know. What I've heard people say, like, "Oh, I'm just playing continuo." I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah,
Continuo. if you screw up the continuo, like the rest
yeah,
of the group is
that's
not
curtains for the whole show. Yeah, the choral anthem that Handel wrote while he was working for the Duke of Chandos. The idea here is I converted this into a kind of concerto in which I changed between the manuals. So for the chorus, I can use a kind of a principal chorus, 8, 4, and 2, and then for the solo parts, the small group, I use just 8 and 2. See if that works. But then I build it up into a massive display piece in the end. It's pretty demanding to do this sort of thing. The famous St. Anne tune. And then change manuals to the solo group. I get going through this, you know, it gets pretty involved. And then finally at the end, I let it become essentially a big full organ piece in which the pedal takes over. And then it becomes a fugue. On with that for a while, but then the pedal takes over fully, and there we add some more stops, and we're going along here. Much in the spirit of his adaptation, except using the feet like there is no tomorrow. The thing about Handel is he just kicks ass. I mean, you know, it's got this incredible energy, and then maybe you could say it's superfluous to start larding on the bicycling and juggling and all that stuff. But it's just part of the fun of it. And I think these, as performers, Bach certainly was a huge show-off, and Handel too. So I think that's in the spirit of it, even if I'm bringing, as they say these days, some of my own subjectivity to the party. There's a guy, Wayne Leipold, publisher, and he wanted, write up those things, write up your adaptations, and I'll try to publish them. But I never did. I just thought, not because I didn't want people to do it, but it's just, I think what I'm doing is pretty idiosyncratic. Very few of these 18th century organs survive in England because they had a lot of wealth in the 19th century and they wanted the latest thing, so they got rid of basically a lot of old organs. There are some examples, and one is at Christ Church Spitalfields in East London, and they restored that 10 years ago or so. It was an organ that had no pedals and was pretty much intact. As a compensation, they have more notes in the manuals, but they insisted on putting a pedal board on it so that you could play Bach. If you have an organ, you have to be able to play Bach on it. This is an idea which has come under at least some scrutiny and been revised, and we have these Italian organs without pedals or with very few pedals, and you're not going to play big Bach works on those. So there is some recognition that these different national styles are legitimate on their own, that you don't have to have a pedal board and be able to play Bach on them. But still, especially in England where there was a huge Bach cult. But on the other hand, I could maybe go to Christ Church Spitalfield and do the Handel thing on that, which is a weird jumble of history. We could have a look in here at the action. This amazing remote control system that was developed already by the 15th century, which you could move your finger or your feet here at the console, at the cockpit of this amazing jet plane of an instrument, and then activate pipes, 10, 20 meters from where the organist was sitting. It's an incredible feat of late Gothic remote control, a system that was in place into the 19th century and that prevailed until electricity made it possible to detach the console and put your pipes basically wherever you wanted to do them. This is a really sensitive action. It looks like just a lot of metal and wood. How can it be so? Yeah, it's like Tinker Toys, but how can it be so sensitive to your touch? Miraculously, it is, because the tolerances are so carefully managed. There are those stories of the wind getting sucked up, or water, worse, getting sucked up into the system and then wreaking major havoc. My German friends, speaking German with them, they say that's not a German word. I say, well, it is now. Words have to be invented, and so there were, of course, these great musicians who left this incredible legacy, like Bach, a huge corpus of music. He sets the standard, but there were many other voices, and not everyone loved his stuff, and there could be even some of his students who came up with stuff that he would have said, hey, that's pretty good, that's interesting. Certainly didn't, in aggregate, achieve anything like his, but still, that's kind of what I'm going for, is a kind of a lesser Bach student or Handel student.
Lesser Bach.
These functionaries.
Yeah.